They call themselves the Nuns on the Bus, traveling the country, calling attention to the needs of the poor.
Will we move beyond individualism back to the principles of our founding fathers and mothers, I'd add, to be we the people of the United States? All of us.
Amen.
We need to stand as the people.
Amen.
And I appreciate the nuns on the bus coming out.
Everywhere on this journey, people are suffering because of broken laws.
I make like $9 an hour. I never have a day off. I need a living wage.
Our main initiative really is the cost of war. That's what we talk about as an organization most of the time. And when I say cost of war, it's not just the financial cost, it's the human cost, it's the environmental cost, it's all the cost of war. Veterans for Peace wants to make sure that people understand that war is not a game, that there's a deep cost, emotional cost of war. These are the types of things that we talk about and try to educate people on so they understand that war is a choice and that war is not going to solve the problems that it's claimed that it will solve.
Now, understand, this matters to people everywhere. Some argue that the spread of these weapons cannot be stopped, cannot be checked, that we are destined to live in a world where more nations and more people possess the ultimate tools of destruction. Such fatalism is a deadly adversary. For if we believe that the spread of nuclear weapons is inevitable, then in some way we are admitting to ourselves that the use of nuclear weapons is inevitable. We must stand together for the right of people everywhere to live free from fear in the 21st century. So today, I state clearly and with conviction America's commitment to seek the peace and security of a world without nuclear weapons.
I demand zero.
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 I demand zero.
Zero.
I demand
Zero. Zero.
I demand zero.
The world must stand together to prevent the spread of these weapons.
What do climate change activists,
advocates for economic justice,
and peace activists have in common?
Shared values. Hopes for a healthy natural environment for future generations,
Equal opportunity and
respect for all life.
war and preparations for war contribute to climate change, destroy life in the environment, and drain the treasury of money for the common good, for education, medical research, housing, and health care.
Efforts to address environmental issues, whether large in scope, like the reclamation of an area the size of Belgium on the lowest plateau in China following centuries of soil and forest degradation, or one of the many thousand grassroots projects like Trees for the Future, a sustainable agricultural program that has planted 750,000 trees in Senegal, one of Africa's most stable democracies, can be successful only in peaceful societies.
Since World War II, the U.S. has not won a major war. Negotiations, rather than military victory, have brought an end to conflict. In Korea, in 1953, with an armistice signed by North and South Korea, China, and the U.S., and in Vietnam in 1973, when the Paris Peace Accords were signed. In 1978, President Jimmy Carter pressed for a peace treaty between Israel and Egypt, ending a state of war that had existed for 25 years. The civil war in Bosnia ended with the peace agreement signed in Dayton, Ohio in 1998. As U.S. Special Envoy to Northern Ireland, former Senator George Mitchell was instrumental in forging the Good Friday peace agreements that put an end to 30 years of war in Northern Ireland.
Although the wars of the 21st century have led to more war rather than to peace, American tax dollars continue to support the world's most powerful and lethal military machine, whose purpose is not primarily the defense of the United States, but the support of global corporations, the fossil fuel industry, and the military-industrial congressional complex.
Because of relentless war planning and the Pentagon's strategy of maintaining overwhelming military superiority, a doctrine called full-spectrum dominance, the U.S. spends more on its military than the next 7 nations combined, including Russia and China, supporting more than 800 military bases and installations, many of them secret, in over 130 countries, hundreds of naval vessels, including 19 functional aircraft carriers patrolling all the world's oceans and seas, and more than 3 times the number of aircraft as Russia has, and more than 4.5 times those of China.
American military power is thus projected around the world, including on the doorsteps of rival nations. From the Naval Air Station in Guam, 1,800 miles from China, the distance between New York and San Antonio, and in other bases in the Pacific, U.S. ships and planes challenge the Chinese in the South China Sea. U.S. soldiers train government troops in Ukraine, and our ships conduct aggressive military exercises in the Black Seas on Russia's shores, while Russian ships roam the North Atlantic. This full-spectrum dominance scenario has intensified the militarization of space by the U.S., with the Russians and Chinese also developing their capacity for space warfare.
I mean, I wish in some ways that you could defeat terrorists with nuclear submarines, because we have a lot of nuclear submarines, they don't have any. It would be over. It's just irrelevant. The great bulk of our military expenditure is wholly irrelevant to the war against terrorism.
And when I say cost of war, it's not just the financial cost, it's the human cost, it's the environmental cost, it's all the cost of war. War is a choice, and that war is not going to solve the problems that it's claimed that it will solve.
While arms control agreements have diminished nuclear weapons arsenals, the arsenals of the 9 nuclear weapons states hold about 15,000 nuclear weapons. The U.S. and Russia possess 90% of those weapons, with over 3,000 of them deployed and aimed at each other's nations. A massive nuclear exchange is likely to result in nuclear winter, disrupting the Earth's systems and ending all life as we know it.
In exchange for Republican ratification of a new nuclear arms reduction treaty with the Russians, President Obama approved plans to modernize the U.S. nuclear arsenal over the next 30 years, ostensibly to enhance safety, effective management, and reliability of nuclear weapons. The total estimated cost for this program is $1.2 trillion, over $40 billion annually.
$40 billion is close to $8 billion more than the National Institutes of Health invest in medical research, and nearly 3 times the Department of the Interior's expenditures in the last years of the Obama administration.
Furthermore, the Trump administration is planning, under the modernization, to produce a new nuclear cruise missile with a variable yield, able to be launched virtually without detection to anywhere on Earth. Such a bomb could be used as a limited first strike weapon.
We want our adversaries to think that we have the capability and the will to use our nuclear weapons. It's in America's interest to keep the Russians guessing if the crazy Americans will pull the trigger. Adam Luther, Director, U.S. Air Force School for Advanced Nuclear Deterrence Studies, Kirkland Air Force Base, New Mexico.
Implementation of the Nuclear Weapons Modernization Plan assures that the widespread call to eliminate nuclear weapons, including that of President Obama himself and preceding presidents, will be largely disregarded for 3 decades, and a new nuclear arms race with Russia and China is likely to develop.
More than half the discretionary budget goes to the military, much of it funding a vast weapons manufacturing system and enormous salaries for their CEOs, like Marilyn Hewson of Lockheed Martin, who earned over $20 million in total compensation in 2015. Compare this to the average minimum wage of less than $12 an hour.
I make like $9 an hour. I never have a day off. I need a living wage.
During the last year of the Obama administration, the military budget of $625 billion took 54 cents out of every discretionary tax dollar. By 2017, the overall cost of wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Pakistan exceeded $4 trillion. To provide some perspective, 1 trillion seconds equals 31,688 years.
58,000 bridges in the U.S., including the Brooklyn Bridge, are structurally deficient. $62 billion, 10% of the total military budget, would repair half of them. $681 million, roughly the cost of 2 Navy F-35C fighter jets, would salvage and protect all Superfund toxic waste sites for 1 year.
A savings of even 1% of the Department of Defense budget, not including the cost of war, could provide over 95,000 infrastructure jobs for 1 year, more than 593,000 Head Start jobs for 1 year, or a year's worth of solar electricity for 3.68 million households.
You take the city down. You get rid of their water, power. In 2, 3, 4, 5 days, they're physically, emotionally, psychologically exhausted. Harlan Ullman, one of the architects of shock and awe, interviewed on CBS on July 30th, 2006.
U.S. forces fired 800 Tomahawk cruise missiles into Baghdad during the first 2 days of the Iraq War. Although shock and awe was intended to so cripple Iraq that U.S. troops would not face serious combat, by 2016, that war took the lives of 4,512 U.S. soldiers, with almost 32,000 wounded. The Department of Veterans Affairs estimates that 11% of Afghan war veterans and 20% of Iraq war veterans suffer from post-traumatic stress. The U.S. does not keep records for civilian deaths in either Afghanistan or Iraq. Estimates by independent organizations covering the first 16 years of warfare vary from a few 100,000 to over 1 million, either as a result of direct hostilities or from malnutrition, stress, and lack of access to clean water or medical care, and other privations of war.
Future generations, too, have been imperiled by the heavy use of nuclear waste in the form of depleted uranium in bombs, missiles, and bullets. Within a year of the invasion of Iraq, a UN environmental report estimated that at least 4 million pounds of radioactive dust covered the country. Depleted uranium has a half-life of 4.5 billion years, meaning that the people of Iraq and Afghanistan face increased rates of cancer, birth defects, and miscarriages until the end of time. By inhaling the radioactive dust released when a weapon containing depleted uranium ignites, thousands of U.S. veterans are also suffering from radiation-induced cancers and other illnesses.
Of course it's about oil. It's very much about oil, and we can't really deny that. We're treating the Arab world as one big gas station. General John Abizayed, U.S. Central Command, with responsibility for Iraq.
Ironically, to secure access to cheap oil, the U.S. military has become the largest single consumer of oil in the world. In 2008, Forbes magazine reported that fuel costs for the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq came to $3 million a day.
An M1 Abrams tank uses 252 gallons of fuel per hour. The F-15 consumes 1,600 gallons per hour, and the B-52 Stratocruiser 3,334 gallons per hour, nearly 7 times the 500 gallons consumed by the average U.S. driver in a year.
In just 2 months, emissions related to military fuel consumption in Iraq alone canceled out 4 years' worth of the emissions reduction achieved through San Francisco's emissions reduction plan.
While the use of fuel can at least be roughly calculated, and the destructive aftermath of bombardments is obvious, the effect of wartime explosions on the atmosphere, and therefore on climate change, cannot be precisely determined. However, it can be reliably assumed that the fires started by bomb explosions release massive amounts of carbon dioxide as well as ash and soot into the atmosphere, as does the bombing of fuel depots and petrochemical plants.
The fate of the climate movement and the fate of the peace movement are intimately bound together. Paul Shannon, American Friends Service Committee.
In urban warfare, chemicals from destroyed building materials, plastics, cell phones, computers, and other elements of modern life also release large quantities of greenhouse gases.
On September 11, 2001, New Yorkers experienced the effects of urban warfare. The enormous toxic dust cloud that rolled through the streets and buildings of Lower Manhattan contained glass fibers, PCBs, and many other toxic materials. Columnist Joseph Kahn of the Boston Globe visited the site 3 weeks later.
Debris from the Twin Towers lay everywhere. Computer parts, melted telephones. The sights, sounds, and smells I encountered that day will stay with me forever.
Producing and testing the weapons and machinery of war have serious consequences for human life and the environment. Nearly 900 of the approximately 1,300 Superfund sites in the United States, those considered the most hazardous to human health and to the environment, are military-related.
Hanford, Washington, where the bomb that destroyed Nagasaki was built, is the biggest Superfund site in the United States. Because of Hanford's proximity to the Columbia River, threats to the delicate surrounding ecosystem continue.
In 2009, the President's Cancer Panel determined that for over 25 years, as many as 500,000 people at Camp Lejeune in South Carolina were using drinking water containing toxic chemicals related to military activity.
In historic Concord, Massachusetts, a company called Nuclear Metals made depleted uranium rounds for the United States Army. The company admitted to dumping 400,000 pounds of uranium waste into an outdoor pit. Although production ended in 1999, cleanup did not begin until 2016.
In Europe, the Department of Defense has admitted that serious environmental damage exists at 70 bases on that continent. For 60 years, the U.S. Navy used the Puerto Rican island of Vieques as a bombing and gunnery practice range. The cancer rate on Vieques, attributed to contamination of land and water, is 27% higher than in the rest of Puerto Rico. In South Korea, the U.S. military dumped toxic formaldehyde into the Han River, which runs through Seoul.
Ever since the just war doctrine was first formulated by St. Augustine in the 5th century of the Common Era, it has been used by tyrants, despots, and democratic political leaders to justify military action. In the last decade of the 20th century, many people challenged the idea that modern warfare, especially in nuclear warfare, with its inevitably high civilian casualties, can meet the just war criteria. In 2010, representatives of the Christian, Muslim, and Jewish faiths formulated 10 principles of just peacemaking based on their sacred texts and religious traditions. Among those principles are
nonviolent direct action, as in Liberia in 2003. When peace negotiations to end 15 years of war came to a standstill, Christian and Muslim women held a sit-in outside the presidential palace, refusing to let anyone leave until they signed a peace treaty. Under democratically elected President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, a Nobel Prize winner, Liberia has advanced both economically and in terms of human rights.
Independent initiatives to reduce threats. In 1958, Nikita Khrushchev, leader of the Soviet Union, initiated a unilateral halting of nuclear testing in the atmosphere. President Dwight Eisenhower announced a ban on U.S. testing later that year. In 1963, after years of complicated negotiations, both superpowers signed a treaty banning the testing of nuclear weapons in the atmosphere, underwater, and in space.
Cooperative conflict resolution. With the help of Cuba, Norway, and Venezuela, President Juan Manuel Santos of Colombia negotiated with the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, the FARC, to end 52 years of conflict in which more than 200,000 people were killed and 5 million displaced.
Just and sustainable economic development. In addition to direct negotiations with the FARC, President Santos has fostered policies like recovery of abandoned farms, development of small-scale businesses, and the health, housing, and education needs of the poor.
Reduce offensive weapons and the weapons trade. Reductions in the stockpiling and deployment of nuclear weapons have been achieved only through negotiations between U.S. presidents and leaders of the Soviet Union and, more recently, of Russia. Pope Francis, in an address to the U.S. Congress, has called for an end to the arms trade.
Here we have to ask ourselves, why are deadly weapons being sold to those who plan to inflict untold suffering on individuals and society? Sadly, the answer, as we all know, is simply for money. Money that is drenched in blood, often innocent blood. In the face of the shameful and culpable silence, it is our duty to confront the problem and to stop the arms trade.
Strengthen the United Nations and international efforts for cooperation and human rights. The United Nations has negotiated peaceful settlements in 172 regional conflicts, including the civil war in El Salvador in 1992 and the Iran-Iraq War. UNICEF has addressed the health and education needs of children in 138 countries, and the World Health Organization has eradicated smallpox and made headway in eliminating polio worldwide. Norway has given $1 billion to Brazil to diminish the rate of deforestation in the Amazon rainforest.
Work with emerging cooperative forces in the international system and encourage grassroots peacemaking and voluntary associations. As environmentalist and author Paul Hawken has documented, over 1 million organizations worldwide are working for peace, justice, including economic justice, human rights, and the environment. In fact, to scroll through a list of all those organizations would take a month of viewing, 24 hours a day. The grassroots action they represent has been responsible for
desegregation and the extension of voting rights in the South during the 1950s and 1960s.
Major environmental legislation like the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts in the early 1970s.
The suspension of military aid by the House of Representatives to the repressive government of El Salvador.
And most recently, in 2017, grassroots protests have led to cancellation of the original attempt by the House of Representatives to repeal the Affordable Care Act.
Sustained grassroots action offers the best hope for addressing the major issues that affect life on the planet: the nuclear menace, climate change, environmental destruction, and economic and social injustice.
Nations have mobilized to wage war or to prepare for war. They have also come together to address major issues, such as the Paris Climate Agreement. In celebration, the U.S. Chief of Mission's residence in Paris was illuminated in green.
In July 2017, 122 countries, excluding the 9 nuclear weapon states and the members of NATO, adopted the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons to encourage steps toward their total elimination.
In that same spirit, can millions of people come together to pursue peace, a sustainable planet, and economic justice?
I'm Mary Hansen, and I live in Northeast Seattle. Militaries worldwide are the largest source of carbon pollution. They're the biggest risk for global warming. We have to demilitarize. People say that we're unrealistic. It's very unrealistic to think that we can go 50 years into the future fully militarized with the risk of nuclear accident, nuclear weapons, and the risk of having nuclear weapons. All of those are risks that are unacceptable risks, but driving rather than mitigating global warming. Our children deserve better.
The earth was small, light blue, and so touchingly alone. Our home that must be defended like a holy relic. Alexei Leonov, Soviet cosmonaut.